This is Bob from BBD News, Geopolitical Views. I'm kind of breaking this whole process up into China and what I think China's after. Then basically, what is it that where India stands? You know, this latest, this recent quadrilateral agreement, the latest quadrilateral summit. First of a kind. Important facts was this was the first priority foreign policies getting together under the Biden administration, which is very critical. It's only after this and when India came on board and after the trip that Defense Secretary Austin is taking to Korea, Japan and India, is a 2+2 happening between China and China and Washington in Alaska. Point to note, the events the way they are planned can show very clearly where his priority is. I think this summit finally put India off to took India off from playing a balancing act that had left it isolated in splendid isolation all these years, and puts it kind of in the corner of democracies. Democracy is redefined, obviously. However, what is the important part here is that what we heard from the statements of the different folks of the Quad was that the centrality of India in this Quad. And here, let's just take a historic perspective to this whole process, right? The historical perspective is this, that Nixon realized and Kissinger that if they wanted to tame the USSR, they needed China. And that's the detonate that happened between Mao and Nixon and the ping-pong diplomacy. And I think now at this point of time, while Trump had realized again that to bring China to heed, you needed Russia. But that's obviously Russia is not playing ball. But now it seems that India might be that critical component that China was to Russia. Rather than Russia being used, it's now India that is now going to be the critical component that does the job of what China did against Russia, and now India will do against China. This is the important part, and I think this summit probably is a turning point in India's foreign policy, almost as dynamic and dramatic as the signing of the nuclear deal between Manmohan Singh and George Bush, right? And the other thing that you have to note is how after this agreement, after the detonate between Washington and Beijing, that China rode very conveniently on the coattails of technology from Washington and money. And the principal players in this was Hollywood, and the most dynamic and the most aggressive was the Wall Street. And you know, between IPOs, between funding new ventures, and it was all about money that these guys got and went and took over companies in the West, stole the technology, end of story. But the Wall Street was only concerned about increasing its valuations, right? But China conveniently used this period to grow hegemonically. And this is the realization that now has come to the West, and they realize, folks, that this really cannot be something that can be left unattended anymore. And what are they looking for? Essentially, the other part that most Indian analysts must remember is the five-finger palm policy of Mao, which is live and thriving now, which will continue to ensure. Firstly, let's see what Claude RP said. He said very clearly that this line 1959 line that Chow and Lai kind of threw up and now seems to have again taken a life of its own, has absolutely no merit and no historical evidence. It does not. It's got not connected to a ridge line or watershed like usually these things are. They're not. This is just for convenience and probably to take over the Shyok River and the Indus River system. And why are these two critical? One is water for life, for agriculture. The other is water for the other major component of the future, which is semiconductors. Huge amount of pure water is needed, and I think they have their iron center in that region for setting up these big fab plants as they go ahead and challenge the hegemony of chip plants from Washington. So we have to keep all these in absolute front and center before we go ahead and decide what China really wants from us. They're going after this, and based on historical evidence that goes back to the 1700s and 1800s, they are folks going to lay claim to Arunachal Pradesh, as they already have done, as they call it South Tibet, once we've allowed Tibet to be part of China. The other is Ladakh, because one doesn't hear this, but the fact of the matter is Ladakh was part of Tibet for a very long time, and was only Maharaja Ranjit Singh and his General Hari Singh that got Ladakh out of Tibet and became a part of Jammu and Kashmir, folks. This is what is going to be used by China to take this part. And here, the most important real estate for India becomes Gilgit and Baltistan. A very interesting article by Shikha Agarwal is the strategy at a softer level of China that has to be watched with close microscope, and a strategy developed to counter it. And this is about, like I've said in the past, India needs to take ownership of Buddhism, and by God, Beijing is doing its best to do that, folks. So you got to fight back, because at the end of the day, enlightenment of Buddhism, of Buddha, he may have been born wherever in Lumbini, but at the end of the day, it was both Gaya and India. So what does she say? Shikha Agarwal. China soon emerged as the most complex dynamic of the global political landscape. The party state established by the Communist Party is an arcane structure that rests upon a propaganda and intelligence apparatus to help sustain the communist leviathan within the Chinese body politic and advance its global interests and international influence. The pivotal agency, not known to many, entrusted with this responsibility is the United Front Work Department, UFWD. Over the past few years, the department has been deepening its footprints within South Asia, including appointing people with UFW backgrounds who head diplomatic missions. This applies to China's current ambassadors in Pakistan and Bangladesh, and its former representative to Sri Lanka. Already, Buddhism has emerged as the major focus. The frontal organization engaged in implementing the department's agenda are the Buddhist Association of China and Asia Pacific Exchange and Cooperation Forum. Here is really good. That's why I made that point earlier, that India was holding a study for all the ASEAN nations here. The WBF is China's primary public relations exercise to project itself as the integral component of Buddhism's history in Asia and the leading stakeholder in the contemporary discourse on the religion. And that is absolutely not true. And here we have to be part of Washington to ensure that the Dalai Lama, they have nothing to do with this election. A crucial component of China's Buddhism strategy is to propel Lumbini, like I said, to the forefront. And that's absolutely not true. It should be junk. And Nepal, even though its sensitivities often come up and down, should be banged on the head. This Buddhism is part of India's heritage. Foreign Country Act, this is operates through a syndicate of sister concerns in other countries and works towards fostering civil society consensus with China's political ideas and sponsored projects. And here, like I said, Hindustan Times, Times of India, constantly can't figure out. I think they're on the payroll. They expand its profile in South Asia through the newly created Bureau of NSW, established in 2017. This bureau is mandated to target the emerging social elites, folks. And social elites include people, IT-related fields, young professionals, and absolutely, as you can see, the Indian folks are totally taken in. And while that happens, what does India say? China needs to do more to restore diplomacy. True. And look at what Beijing's nefarious designs, right? Beijing nudges visa applicants to get China-made vaccines. What kind of nonsense is that? Folks, you tell me. Then China refuses to give WHO COVID data. Officials withhold raw personal patient information that could help determine origins. Well, I am not surprised, and this is what actually helps China get the money. Pharma groups tap into China healthcare, and I'm not sure why these pharma groups, Western pharma groups, are tapping in, because it's their whole patents, everything is going to get stolen, folks. But like everything is not okay with China, folks. Things are in trouble, as it says. Peril lurks in China's growth story. China's job market remains fragile. Consumer spending hasn't kept pace with the broader recovery in economic output. Debt levels, already a problem before the pandemic, grew at their fastest pace in more than a decade during the first 9 months of 2020. While asset bubbles in stocks and real estates kept growing, Chinese central bank faces a tricky balance between reining in stimulus without causing growth to sputter. He says last year China lost more than 5 million migrant job workers, folks. And he says meanwhile a record 8.7 million college students are expected to graduate this year, and they are having an exceedingly tough time, folks. Folks, more trouble on the economic front. Fresh wave of defaults from China, from corporate China expected this year, is likely to bring a series of defaults from China after a string of blow-ups in 2020. At the same time, about 2.5 of Chinese offshore high-yield debts by face value is likely to face default this year, according to JP Morgan. And internally, obviously this is going to have a problem with investment, as you see. Ant resists Beijing's demand for data. Now this is very interesting. Beijing feels pinch of coal imports curb. So the shoe bites. You can keep banning and trying to teach countries like Australia a lesson, but it bites. Shoe bites. Ban on buying the resources from Australia worsens shortage amid a cold winter. Then you have another one. American farm exports to China surge. Well, this is a picture when farm exports surge, folks. It's not about giving kudos to China that they're helping America out. This is points towards shortage of food in China, folks. A real soft belly. And then what do we have? China Belt and Road Initiative is a mess. He says China's fragmented development financing system is also ill-suited to directing the BRI for geopolitical ends. Diplomatic, military, and strategic agencies are barely involved, folks. And the important part here is this results in piecemeal, non-strategic approvals of many questionable loans and investment, and around half of Chinese overseas investments are loss-making. Right? We see recurrent corruption scandals around energy projects in Kazakhstan and protests around land grabbing in Cambodia as regime-linked tycoons and the Chinese partners operate without impunity. And that, folks, is the reality about this BRI. It may just end up being a huge mess and not a master stroke or a master plan. But what's happening here? What's happening against it? A quiet Washington mobilization against China. This week's report by a bipartisan commission on artificial intelligence is an early sign of what could become a major shift in Washington's economic strategy. Without much public debate, Washington is moving towards what amounts to a version of industrial policy to compete with China on technology. Here again, China's rise spurs Washington's push on chip supply. With a $50 billion incentive program, the SIA predicts that Washington's share capacity would rise to 14% in a decade. Time, it says, is of the essence. Manufacturers are deciding now on locations that will lift capacity 56% in the next decade. And here, India must immediately offer, folks, Ladakh. Then you have rise in anti-China feelings as many people in London considered it a critical threat. Many Londonites view China as a critical threat and oppose deepening economic ties with countries, a survey found. And Chinese students face ban amid security fears. Hundreds of Chinese postgraduate students are to be banned from study-sensitive subjects in all universities in and around London, folks. This is getting hairy and scary. Jai Hind.